Hi, my name is Marlo Hood. Welcome to a new edition of the AFP Foundation's training course for journalists on climate change and sustainable development. Planet Earth has its limits, and humanity is testing them. When first articulated by English cleric Thomas Malthus in the late 18th century, this was a startling idea. Up to then, across almost all cultures, nature had always been seen as a divine and immovable force. Our humble species, we thought, existed well within its confines. Malthus, however, postulated that human population would grow exponentially, while our food supply would not, leading to an ever-widening gap and eventually mass starvation. The solution he proposed was no less revolutionary or controversial: birth rate control. But the Industrial Revolution and the technologies it spawned, of course, allowed our numbers to expand unfettered and turned the good professor's name into a synonym for alarmist nonsense. Ultimately, however, the world's most famous doomsayer may have been right, because at 7 billion, going on 11, humanity has today placed an almost unbearable stress on our host planet's resources, which have turned out to not be inexhaustible after all. Today we must squarely face this question: how much more can we extract from Earth before we irretrievably disrupt the environment that made our very existence possible? In 1987, the UN defined sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The concept gained in prominence at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, which adopted Agenda 21, a plan for advancing human progress without destroying natural resources or further polluting the planet. But our expanding numbers, 7.3 billion today, have laid those plans to waste. Within the span of a single human generation, for example, human appetites have emptied the oceans of half their living mass. More broadly, we have tipped the planet into what scientists call a mass extinction event, only the sixth in the last 500 million years. True, agricultural yields have increased, but 1 billion people still don't have enough to eat, and Earth's per capita biocapacity, that is, the average area of life-sustaining land available to each individual, continues to dwindle. By the end of the century, there will be an additional 4 billion mouths to feed. Even at current rates, humankind consumes the equivalent of 1.5 planets' worth of resources every year, cutting down trees faster than they grow, harvesting more fish than the oceans can replenish, and depositing more waste, including climate-altering greenhouse gases, than can safely be absorbed. Put another way, it takes Earth 18 months to regenerate what we use in 12. By 2030, we will likely need a second planet the same size to support our appetites. The problem, of course, is that we only have one. Human activity has abruptly ended an 11,000-year period of climate stability, known as the Holocene. The new era, in which humans have become the main drivers of planetary change, has been dubbed the Anthropocene, the age of man. In 2009, a group of influential environmental scientists coined another term, planetary boundaries. It was an attempt to define safe limits for human interference with 9 Earth systems, which, even as they interact, are distinct. For 3 of them, they found, humans have already crossed a red line, largely due to our massive reliance on fossil fuels and industrial-scale agriculture. Failure to bring them back to within the safety zone will have dire consequences. The first of these is climate change. For a couple hundred years, our species has burned coal, oil, and natural gas to produce food and keep ourselves warm. We have also relied on fossil fuels to power transportation, industry, communications, and more recently, the IT revolution. It is hard, in other words, to imagine life without them. But this abundant energy source has come at a terrible hidden price in the form of accumulated heat-trapping greenhouse gases, chiefly carbon dioxide, but also methane and nitrous oxide. The warmer it gets, the more severe the effects. 195 nations gathered under the UN umbrella are negotiating a global pact to rein in these greenhouse gas emissions and cap global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the benchmark corresponding roughly to 1850. This is the threshold beyond which, scientists say, humankind will face a bleak future of mass migration, water wars, deepening poverty, and food shortages. Avoiding this bleak scenario will require a wholesale switch to renewable sources of energy, such as wind, sunlight, and ocean waves. But action and investment has been slow, and some fear it may already be too late. The second boundary crossed concerns species lost. Extinction is a natural process that began as soon as there was life on Earth. But under the Anthropocene, species have been disappearing at a much faster rate. In fact, 100 to 1,000 times faster than just a century ago. The causes include overfishing, deforestation to make way for farms, mines, industry, and dwellings, the poisoning of soil and water, both fresh and ocean, with agricultural chemicals and toxic waste, and, as we have seen, changes in the very composition of the atmosphere. Forests, especially in the tropics, are dense with species diversity. The planet's lungs, they are not only providing the oxygen we breathe, but lock away the CO2 we emit. More than 1 billion people depend on them directly for their sustenance. And yet, decades after humanity recognized their fragile value, forests are still being cleared at a rate of 50 football fields every minute, mainly through burning. The most recent mass extinction event saw the disappearance of all non-avian dinosaurs and most other life forms about 65 million years ago. The most dramatic wiped out 95% of the planet's life forms. Scientists say we have now entered the 6th. The third planetary boundary humans have crossed, mainly through agriculture, concerns the nitrogen cycle. For plants to grow, they need nitrogen, a chemical locked in animal and plant waste that falls to the ground. Bacteria in the soil converts this organic matter into a form of nitrogen that plants can use. When the plants die and decay, the cycle begins anew. But factory-made fertilizers, rich in nitrogen, along with the burning of fossil fuels, has caused a chemical imbalance in the soil, poisoning water resources and adding yet more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Other planetary boundaries where human activity is pushing us into the danger zone include ocean acidification, driven by atmospheric CO2 levels, overuse of fresh water, and chemical pollution. The one boundary we have managed to partially restore is Earth's protective ozone layer, which had been depleted by man-made gases. Planetary boundaries affect one another. Climate change, for example, can accelerate species loss, and deforestation causes more CO2 to be released in the atmosphere. Another example is ice, which plays a crucial role in reflecting solar radiation back into space. As the globe warms, the ice melts, causing more heat to be absorbed by the newly exposed land or water, which in turn causes temperatures to rise further and more ice to melt in an ever-accelerating vicious cycle. Exceeding these boundaries, scientists say with alarm, may have impacts we still cannot anticipate and could even cause a sudden and complete collapse of a given system. Despite this picture of voracious, locust-like consumption by humans of everything in our path, it is actually a relative few who do the most damage. At one end of the spectrum, a third of all the food produced, well over 1 billion tons per year, is lost, spoiled, or simply thrown away. At the other end, nearly 1 billion people do not get enough calories in their bodies every day, and 800 million lack clean water. And here's the connection. Earth's poorest residents are most vulnerable to the consequences of violating planetary boundaries. Lacking the money and technology that isolates the rich world, they rely directly on dwindling and compromised resources under pressure from climate change, pollution, and overexploitation. In the year 2000, the nations of the world adopted the Millennium Development Goals in a bid to address some of these imbalances. The MDGs, as they came to be known, were crystallized in 8 targets to be achieved by 2015: ending poverty and hunger, boosting access to education, promoting gender equality, reducing child mortality, combating AIDS, malaria, TB, and other diseases, all while ensuring environmental stability. The MDGs have, in some ways, been a stunning success. Poverty rates have been cut, due in part to rapid economic growth in China. The number of undernourished has fallen by almost half. Access to clean drinking water and sanitation has improved. Enrollment in primary education in developing nations has shot up. The mortality rate of children under 5 has been more than halved. Malaria deaths have been also reduced. But many goals were missed. Global unemployment rates are higher. Aid to the world's least developed nations has decreased, and carbon dioxide emissions increased by over 50% between 1990 and 2012. Hundreds of millions of people still live in slums, go hungry, and have no access to the most basic of human needs: clean water, nutritious food, and rudimentary health care. Achieving the MDGs relied largely on money flowing from rich to poor nations. But there's an inbuilt contradiction within this approach. It is predicated on the continuing economic expansion of the nations that led industrialization, thus compounding the very problems pushing our planet to the brink: massive consumption, extraction of natural resources, and all the pollution that goes with it. A burgeoning middle class in many developing countries, a milestone of progress by one measure, tasks the planet's carrying capacity even further. Which brings us back to square one. Can we increase the number of people living healthy and happy lives without depleting Earth's public goods? Water, clean air, animals, plants, and life-sustaining soil? In other words, can human progress and nature coexist? In September 2015, the United Nations adopted a new set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals in a new bid to find the right balance. These targets, while seeking to end extreme poverty, place a bigger emphasis on planetary health. Their goals include more responsible consumption and production in agriculture and industrial fishing, better management of resources, and reducing pollution. When it comes to food and water security for the world's most vulnerable, the focus is on providing durable, long-term solutions. Laying out this new set of goals was a challenge, but the real test will be our political, financial, and moral commitment to profound change. Here then are a few tips for journalists when we're talking about planetary boundaries. This story is more than statistics. It's more than the number of species or acres that have disappeared. It's really about the core conflict between, or the core tension rather, between expanding human presence and the capacity of the globe to sustain it. So rather than illustrate it with numbers, illustrate it with examples. Second point, the center of gravity on this story has very clearly shifted from is there a problem and should we do something on the one hand to what should we do and what are the solutions. Third point, when talking about these different kinds of planetary boundaries, whether it's species loss or the nitrogen cycle or biodiversity, don't forget that all of these different things interact, and sometimes it's those interactions that are the most dangerous and the most interesting from a journalistic standpoint. Finally, last thing I would suggest that you bear in mind as you're writing about this story, and this applies really across the board on the climate change story and when we're talking about sustainability, is bear in mind that the impacts of these different imbalances that we've highlighted are felt very unequally across the globe. Different societies have different capacities to withstand these shocks, and in many cases it boils down simply to a matter of money. Here are a few points to retain. 1. Welcome to the Anthropocene, the new geological epoch in Earth's 4.6 billion year history, in which the biggest impacts on ecosystems come from human activity. Number 2. We have, alas, entered the 6th global mass extinction. What does that mean? The die-off among Earth's estimated 3 million species is happening 100, perhaps 1,000 times faster than just a century ago. Number 3. Of 9 planetary boundaries identified by scientists, we have already crossed 3. Climate change, species lost, and a huge imbalance in Earth's natural nitrogen cycle. Number 4. The human population, 7.3 billion today, is expected to grow to 8.5 billion in 2030, 9.7 in 2050, and 11.2 billion souls by 2100. And finally, as it is, we're already using up 1.5 planets worth of resources every year, meaning that it takes Earth 18 months to replace what we consume in 12. So, to finish off this first episode in our series, we're going to seg you into a special video that AFP made in order to kick off COP21 in Paris.
World leaders are trying to show off their green credentials, from the US president's trip to Alaska to Francois Hollande's visit to Iceland. Glaciers are melting at an alarming rate, this one reducing by 50 metres a year.
All of these people have come to see the effects of global warming, but we're not trying to promote a kind of global warming tourism. We cannot become willing spectators of our own demise.
Climate change is affecting us all. Sea levels have risen by 20 centimetres since 1900, and there's an increase in droughts, heat waves and cyclones. The average global temperature has risen by 1 degree since the pre-industrial era, and this is mainly down to humans. Limiting warming to 2 degrees or even less is the #1 priority of the Paris COP21 conference. That needs a reduction of 40 to 70% of greenhouse gases by 2050 and a major change of habits. Fossil fuels, the main emitters, still account for 80% of world energy production.
There is a good news part of this story, because even as the pollution has continued to mount up, the technologists and business leaders have brought down the cost of electricity from renewable sources to the point where now it's cheaper than electricity from burning fossil fuels in the majority of countries now.
China and the United States are the top 2 polluters on the planet. They say they're determined to succeed in Paris, where they failed in Copenhagen in 2009. Nearly 150 heads of state and government are at the conference, so reaching a deal won't be easy. But ensuring concrete action afterwards promises to be harder still.